Chapter 1 of the Magic Mimics in Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. Chapter 1. Toto carries a message. Toto, called Princess Ozma of Oz, as a small black dog trotted down the corridor past the open door of her study in the royal palace of the Emerald City. "Toto, will you do me a favor?" "Certainly," answered the little dog, his bright eyes regarding the Princess questioningly. "What can I do for your Majesty?" Ozma smiled. "I wonder if you would go to Dorothy's rooms and ask her to join me here as soon as possible." "That'll be easy, Ozma," said Toto. "I was just on my way to see Dorothy. It's time for our morning romp in the garden." "Well," laughed Ozma, "I shall keep Dorothy for only a few minutes. Then she can join you in the garden for your play." "Thank you, Ozma," replied Toto, as he turned and trotted down the corridor leading to Dorothy's suite of rooms. As the little dog disappeared, the smile slowly faded from Ozma's face, and the lovely little ruler of the world's most beautiful fairyland looked unusually serious. The truth was that Ozma was thinking of events that had happened many years before in the history of the Land of Oz. Not always had Oz been a fairy realm. In those olden times, Oz had been nothing more than a remarkably beautiful country of rolling plains, wooded hills, and rich farmlands. Indeed, Oz had not been so much different from our own United States, except that it was surrounded on all sides by a deadly desert. It was this desert which prevented curious men from the great outside world from finding their way to Oz. For the fumes and gases that rose from the shifting sands of the desert were deadly poison to all living things, and for a human to have set foot on the desert would have meant instant and terrible death. Consequently, all living things avoided the deadly desert, and it is no wonder that Oz was so entirely secluded and went unnoticed by the rest of the world for so many long years. Meanwhile, the Oz people were happy and contented, living their simple, carefree lives without worries or troubles. The soil of Oz was fertile and the people naturally industrious, so there was always an abundance of everything for everyone. Hence, destructive and terrible wars were unknown in Oz even in the olden days. One fine day, Queen Lurline, ruler of all the fairies in the world, chanced to be flying over the Land of Oz with her fairy band. She was greatly impressed with the beauty of the hidden country. The Fairy Queen paused, flying in wide circles over the peaceful land. Here was a country so entirely beautiful and charming that it deserved to be a fairy realm. Queen Lurline sought out the king of this favored land and found him to be an old man with no son or daughters to whom he could pass on his crown. With great joy, the old king accepted the tiny baby fairy whom Queen Lurline placed in his care. When the baby fairy attained her full age of girlhood, no fairy ever appears to be older than a young girl of 14 or 15, she was to be crowned Princess Ozma of Oz. From the time of Lurline's visit, Oz became a fairyland, abounding in enchantments and strange happenings. Indeed, several of the inhabitants of Oz fell to studying the magic arts and became witches and magicians, very nearly preventing Ozma from becoming the rightful ruler of the fairyland. Ozma was fully aware that she was a member of Queen Lurline's fairy band, and she was justly proud of her immortal heritage. She knew, too, that she owed allegiance to the powerful Fairy Queen, and that was the reason she appeared so thoughtful this morning as she awaited Princess Dorothy. Ozma's reverie was broken by a gentle rap on the open door. Looking up, she saw Dorothy standing in the doorway. "Come in, my dear," said Ozma. "There's something I must discuss with you." End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Ozma and Glinda Go Away. "What is it, Ozma?" Dorothy asked as she sat down beside her friend. "Dorothy," Ozma began thoughtfully, "you have heard me tell the story of how the good Queen Lurline left me here as a baby to become the ruler of the Land of Oz." "Of course, Ozma, and how you were stolen by old Mombi the Witch and—" "Yes," interrupted Ozma, smiling, "all that is true, but the important fact is that now the day has arrived when I must answer the summons of the great Fairy Queen. You see," continued the girlish ruler seriously, "every 200 years all the members of Queen Lurline's fairy band gather for a grand council in the beautiful forest of Burzee, which lies just across the Deadly Desert to the south of Oz." "Isn't that the forest where Santa Claus was found as an infant and adopted by the forest nymph?" asked Dorothy eagerly. "Yes," replied Ozma. "Burzee is indeed a famous forest. For untold centuries its cool groves have been the meeting place of Queen Lurline and her subjects. They gather to discuss and plan the work they will do during the next 2 centuries. In the old days," Ozma's voice was musing and thoughtful as she continued, "when mankind was simpler and gentler of nature, it was easier for the fairies to do their good works and to aid the helpless humans. But today, few humans believe in fairies." "The children do," Dorothy suggested. "Yes," said Ozma, "but unfortunately, as the children grow older and become men and women, they forget all they ever knew about fairies. I wish," she added wistfully, "that the men and women of the world would keep a bit of their childhood with them. They would find it a valuable thing." "When will you be going, Ozma?" Dorothy asked softly. "Tomorrow morning," Ozma replied. "And so important is this meeting that I have asked Glinda the Good to accompany me, although she is not a member of Queen Lurline's fairy band." "Ozma," said Dorothy seriously, her chin cupped in her hand, "there is one thing I have often wondered about. What did Queen Lurline do after she left you here to become the ruler of Oz?" "There is a story," Ozma began with a faraway look in her eyes, "that after she made Oz a fairyland, Queen Lurline flew away to the land of the Phanfasms, that strange realm lying southeast of Oz, across the Deadly Desert and bordering the Kingdom of the Gnomes." "I remember the Phanfasms," Dorothy nodded. "They are the wicked creatures who came with the Gnome King through his tunnel under the Deadly Desert to conquer Oz." "Yes, and thanks to the wisdom of our famous Scarecrow, we were able to render them harmless," Ozma recalled with a smile. "Did Queen Lurline go to see the Phanfasms after she left Oz?" asked Dorothy. "No," replied Ozma. "It seems that instead of going to Mount Phantastico, where the Phanfasms dwell, Queen Lurline flew to the second of the Twin Peaks, to Mount Illuso, home of the dread Mimiks." "I don't remember hearing about the Mimiks before. Just who are they, Ozma?" asked Dorothy with interest. "Not a great deal is known about them," replied Ozma seriously, "and what we do know is so unpleasant that the Mimiks are avoided as a subject of conversation. They are not humans, nor are they immortals. Like the Phanfasms, to whom they are closely related, they belong to the ancient race of Erbs, creatures who inhabited the earth long before the coming of mankind. Both the Mimiks and the Phanfasms hate all humans and immortals, for they feel that mankind, aided by the immortals, has stolen the world from them." "They don't sound very nice to me," said Dorothy with a shudder. "Why did Queen Lurline go to see such dreadful creatures?" Ozma's voice was grave as she answered. "Queen Lurline knew that the Mimiks bitterly hated all that was good and happy and just in the world. The wise Queen fully realized that now that Oz was so beautiful and favored and its people so happy and contented a fairy folk, the Mimiks would lose no time in seeking to bring unhappiness to Oz. It was to prevent this that Queen Lurline paid her visit to Mount Illuso." "And did she succeed?" asked Dorothy. "Yes, my dear," replied Ozma. "Queen Lurline placed a fairy spell on the Mimiks to make it impossible for them to attack the inhabitants of Oz. But let's not discuss the unpleasant Mimiks any further," Ozma concluded. "Thanks to good Queen Lurline, we don't even have to think about the creatures. Let us return to our conversation about you." "About me?" asked Dorothy. "Yes," replied Ozma. "Can't you guess why I asked you to see me this particular morning?" "Why, to tell me about the trip you and Glinda are planning," said Dorothy. "And something more, too," continued Ozma. "Who do you think will rule the Emerald City and the Land of Oz while both Glinda and I are absent?" "I suppose either the little wizard or the Scarecrow," ventured Dorothy, remembering that in the past both the wizard and the Scarecrow had ruled the Land of Oz. "No," replied Ozma calmly. "You, Dorothy, will be the ruler of the Emerald City and the Land of Oz in my absence." "I?" cried Dorothy. "Oh, Ozma, I'm only a little girl. I don't know the first thing about ruling." "You are a Princess of Oz," stated Ozma with dignity. "I shall appoint the wizard as your counselor and advisor. With his wisdom and your honesty of heart and sweetness of nature, I am confident the Land of Oz will be well ruled." Dorothy was silent, considering. "Come, my dear," said Ozma with a smile. "I shall be gone only 3 short days. I am sure once you have become accustomed to the idea, you will enjoy the novel experience of being a real ruler, so do not worry." Rising from the divan, Ozma concluded, "I must go now to inform the courtiers and lords and ladies of my journey. I will instruct them in the regular affairs of state to be carried on in my absence, so that you will not be annoyed with these routine matters." Ozma kissed Dorothy on the cheek, and the 2 girls left the room arm in arm, parting a few minutes later as Ozma went about making preparations for her journey. Dorothy joined Toto, who was waiting patiently for her in the lovely gardens of the royal palace. The little dog quickly noticed that his mistress was not nearly so carefree in her play as usual, but seemed more serious and thoughtful. He wondered if this had anything to do with her conversation with Ozma, but since Dorothy didn't mention the subject to him and seemed to be so busy with her own thoughts, Toto, being a wise little dog, refrained from troubling her with questions. Dorothy had a long talk with the wizard later in the day. The little man pointed out that Dorothy's duties as a ruler would be very slight. So well governed was Oz, and so well behaved were the Oz people. Nevertheless, Dorothy was greatly cheered and relieved when the wizard promised to help her should any problem arise that she found troubling. Ozma's time was so entirely taken up with affairs of state and the many preparations for her absence from her beloved country that Dorothy saw nothing of the girlish ruler during the remainder of the day. The morning of Ozma and Glinda's departure dawned bright and clear, with the sunlight shining brilliantly on the beautiful City of Emeralds. Breakfast had been over for several hours when Glinda the Good Sorceress arrived from her castle far to the south in the Quadling country of the Land of Oz. Glinda and Ozma went immediately to the royal throne room, where the famous Oz personages waited to witness their departure. At exactly 10 o'clock, Princess Ozma seated herself in her emerald throne, while the stately Glinda stood to her right. Before them was a strange and impressive an assemblage of nobles, courtiers, and old friends as ever gathered together in any fairy realm. Among those present were the famous Scarecrow of Oz, with his highly polished companion Nick Chopper, the nickel-plated Tin Woodman; comical Jack Pumpkinhead, astride the wooden Sawhorse, who was Ozma's personal steed and earliest companion; Scraps, the jolly Patchwork Girl; sweet little Trot and her faithful sailor friend, grizzled old Cap'n Bill; Betsy Bobbin and her mule Hank; the cheerful Shaggy Man, looking shaggier than ever; the highly magnified and thoroughly educated Wogglebug, wearing his wisest expression for this important occasion; the stately Cowardly Lion, who was one of Dorothy's oldest friends, and his companion the Hungry Tiger, who longed to devour fat babies but never did because his conscience wouldn't permit him to; that strange creature, the Woozy, whose eyes flashed real fire when he became angry; Button Bright, the boy from Philadelphia who had been Dorothy's companion on several wonderful adventures; Ojo the Lucky and his Unk Nunkie; Dorothy's beloved Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, and of course the little Wizard and many, many others. Ozma stood before her throne and raised her hand. Immediately silence settled over the assemblage in the vast throne room. "As you all know," the Princess said, "Glinda and I are about to attend an important fairy conference in the distant forest of Burzee. We shall be gone from Oz for a period of 3 days. During that time, Princess Dorothy will be your sovereign and ruler." Ozma removed her dainty fairy wand from the folds of her gown and lifted it into the air. For a moment she smiled on all, then, with a graceful wave of the wand, and before the onlookers realized what was happening, both she and Glinda had vanished. But Dorothy knew that even at that moment Queen Lurline was greeting the lovely Ozma and the stately Glinda in the depths of the enchanted forest of Burzee. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of the Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Mount Illuso. On that faraway day, those many years ago, when Queen Lurline had left the baby Ozma to become ruler of Oz, Queen Lurline did not pause, for she knew the most important part of her work was still to be done. If the Land of Oz was to be the happy fairyland she hoped it would be, she must protect it from the evil of the Mimiks. With this thought in mind, the good Queen left Oz and flew straight to the bleak land of the Phanfasms. Signaling to one of her fairy maidens to accompany her, Queen Lurline flew down to grim Mount Illuso, home of the dread Mimiks. Pausing at the entrance to the great hollow mountain, Queen Lurline bade her fairy companion await her return. Then, taking the precaution to make herself invisible to the eyes of the Mimiks, the Fairy Queen stepped into the enchanted mountain. The sight that met her eyes caused even the good Queen Lurline to chill and falter momentarily on the rocky ledge on which she stood. Above her rose the vast cavernous walls of the hollow mountain. Spread out below were the corridors burrowed into the rock by the Mimiks. In dark caverns deep below these corridors the monsters made their homes. All of this scene was lighted by flaming torches set at intervals in the walls of the cavern. The torches flared deep red, casting lurid, flickering shadows and adding to the weird unreality of the scene. As Queen Lurline gazed, the Mimiks were moving through the rough-hewn corridors or flying through the air. The most unusual thing about the creatures was their strange habit of constantly changing their shapes. They shifted restlessly from one form to another. Since they were creatures of evil, the shapes they assumed were all forms of the blackest evil and dread. Even as Queen Lurline watched, fascinated by the strange spectacle, the Mimiks shifted and changed and flitted from one loathsome shape to another. A monster bird with leathery wings and a horned head dropped to the ground, and in another second assumed the squat body of a huge toad with the head of a hyena, snarling with laughter. A crawling red lizard, all of 10 feet in length, turned into a giant butterfly with black wings and the body of a serpent. A great green bat with wicked talons alighted on a ledge not far from Queen Lurline, and in an instant changed to a mammoth hairy creature with the body of a huge ape and the head of an alligator. The good queen shuddered in spite of herself. What she had seen only served to strengthen her resolution to protect the Oz people for all time against the Mimiks. Immediately she began weaving a powerful incantation. In a few minutes the enchantment was completed. Queen Lurline breathed a sigh of relief, for she knew that the Mimiks were now powerless to harm any of the fairy inhabitants of the Land of Oz. Queen Lurline was well aware that the Mimiks' strange habit of changing their shapes was the least of their evil characteristics. Much more dreadful was the power possessed by these creatures to steal the shapes of both mortals and immortals. A Mimic accomplished this simply by casting himself on the shadow of his victim. Instantly the Mimic arose, a perfect double in outward appearance of the person whose shadow he had stolen. As for the unfortunate victim, he fell into a spell of enchantment, unable to move or speak, but conscious of all that was taking place about him. No wonder Queen Lurline sighed with relief when she thought that her powerful magic had made the Oz people secure against the dread evil of the Mimiks. Queen Lurline slipped from the cavern through the stone portal of Mount Illuso. For a moment she paused, breathing deeply and gratefully of the fresh air. But she must not tarry now. She still had other important work to do here. When she returned to her fairy companion, Queen Lurline gave her brief instructions concerning the important part she was to play at Mount Illuso in the coming years. Then they both spread their fairy wings and flew straight to the very summit of the hollow mount. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The Mimiks Mean Mischief. On the same morning that Ozma and Glinda left the Land of Oz for the Forest of Burzee, events of equal importance were happening in Mount Illuso, home of the Mimiks. The Mimiks were ruled over by two sovereigns, King and Queen Raah. It is a question which was the more wicked and dangerous of this pair. King was bold and brutal, while his wife Queen Raah was clever and cunning. Together they made a fitting combination to rule so wicked a horde as the Mimiks. On this particular morning, King and Queen Raah secluded themselves in a hidden cavern deep in the underground caves that honeycombed the depths of hollow Mount Illuso. Roughly hewn from the grey rock, this cavern was circular in shape and was filled with ancient books and strange and weird implements of sorcery and enchantment. King possessed little skill in magic arts, but Queen Raah was powerful in the practice of conjuring and evil incantation. After the visit of Queen Lurline to Mount Illuso and the casting of the powerful enchantment that prevented King and Queen Raah from leading their Mimic subjects in the destruction of Oz, Queen Raah had at first raged and fumed and wildly vowed vengeance on Queen Lurline and Princess Ozma. Then, as the years passed by, the evil queen spent more and more time lurking in the secret cavern, studying the ancient sorcery of the herbs, employing her black arts to follow events in the history of Oz, and plotting the destruction of the fairyland. Of course, the Mimic King and Queen were free to lead their hordes in attacks on people of other lands, and you may wonder why they didn't forget all about Oz and content themselves with bringing misery to other countries. The reason was that the wicked King and Queen of the Mimiks despised all that was good, and they could not endure the thought of the Oz people living in peace and contentment, safe from their evil doing. So long as the Oz inhabitants remained the happiest people in all the world, King and Queen Raah could derive no satisfaction in bringing misery to other less happy lands. Queen Raah was well aware that Princess Ozma was one of the most powerful fairy rulers in existence, and that her loyal friend, Glinda the Good, was the mightiest and wisest of all sorceresses. Nevertheless, through her own dark magic, Queen Raah had recently made two important discoveries that raised her hopes so high that she believed she might be able soon to defy both Ozma and Glinda. First, she had discovered that Ozma and Glinda were about to depart on a journey that would take them away from the Land of Oz. Second, she had learned that in one of Ozma's books of magic records in the royal palace of the Emerald City was written the charm that would break the spell Queen Lurline had cast on the Mimiks to protect Oz. This morning, Queen Raah had assumed the shape of a huge woman, almost a giantess, with the head of a grey wolf. King wore the form of a black bear with an owl head. The Queen held in her hands a circlet of dully gleaming metal. The red eyes of her wolf head gazed at it steadily while she mumbled an incantation. As the wolf-headed woman spoke, a wisp of grey mist appeared in the center of the metal ring. The mist expanded into a ball, growing denser in appearance. Next it became milky in hue, then opalescent, finally glowing as with an inner light. Slowly, a scene appeared in the metal-bound ball of shimmering opal mist. While King and Queen Raah watched, the throne room of the royal palace in the Emerald City grew distinct in the milky depths of the captive ball. Princess Ozma stood by her throne with Glinda the Good at her side. The lips of the little ruler were moving, forming words, although the Mimic monarchs could distinguish no sound. Ozma was addressing her subjects. Then the girl ruler smiled and raised her wand. In an instant both Ozma and Glinda had vanished. The ball of glowing mist disappeared. With a clatter, Queen Raah threw the metal circlet to the stone floor of the cave and triumphantly faced the owl-headed bear. "They have gone!" she cried. "You are positive that now is the time for us to act?" asked King "Absolutely," said the wolf-headed woman. "We know that one of Ozma's magic record books holds the secret of the enchantment cast on us. We know that Ozma and Glinda will be absent from Oz for 3 days, leaving the country and the Emerald City unprotected by their magic arts. We know that those people who have in recent years come from the great outside world to live in Oz were not inhabitants of Oz when Lurline made it a fairyland. Thus they are not protected by the enchantment she cast on us. It will be simple for us to assume the shapes of these people. Of course they are mere mortals," the Queen added with a sneer. "But even so, they will serve our purpose." "You have a plan, then?" asked the owl-headed king. "A plan that will result in the utter destruction of Oz and the enslavement of the Oz people," asserted the Queen with grim relish. "Listen," the wolf-headed woman commanded. "Tonight you and I, with Styg and Ebo, will fly swiftly across the deadly desert to the Land of Oz. We will go directly to the Emerald City. There we will seek out the two mortals from the great outside world whose shapes will admit us to every part of the royal palace. My magic arts have told me that at a certain hour tomorrow morning these two mortals will be together with no one else about to witness or interfere with our deed. After we have stolen their shapes, the helpless mortals will be seized by Styg and Ebo and returned here where they will be our prisoners. Then we will be free to search through Ozma's magic record books. As soon as we locate the magical antidote to Lurline's enchantment, we will break the spell binding our subjects. By the time Ozma and Glinda return, Oz will be overrun by Mimiks, and we shall be ready to give their royal highnesses a proper reception." Queen Raah smiled wickedly as she finished this recital. The owl eyes of King had been regarding Queen Raah intently as she revealed her plan. When she had finished, an evil leer spread over the king's furry features. "Raah," said King "you are the most wicked queen who ever ruled the Mimiks." And that, by Mimic standards, was the highest compliment King could pay his queen. Several hours after midnight, King and Queen Raah, followed by the two Mimiks, Styg and Ebo, slipped outside the entrance of the hollow mountain. Immediately all four assumed the shapes of giant birds, black of plumage and with powerful wings. During the creatures' long flight over the deadly desert to Oz, they changed shapes a number of times, but always to another form of powerful bird. As they mounted into the air and soared through the dark night over the peak of Mount Illuso, King cast a backward glance toward the summit of the mountain. "What about the Guardian?" he asked Queen Raah uneasily. "Bah!" the giant bird that was Queen Raah croaked derisively. "Who cares about her? Let her go on dreaming over her foolish flowers and sticks of wood. That's all she has done all these years." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5 Prisoners of the Mimiks. High in the top of the tallest tower of the royal palace was the wizard's apartment. In this secluded spot, the little man kept his magical tools and apparatus and could work undisturbed for long hours over difficult feats of magic. The morning after Ozma and Glinda had left, Dorothy had climbed the stairs to the wizard's quarters, and she and the wizard were deep in a discussion of matters of state. Two sides of the room they occupied were composed of tall French windows, rising from the floor to the ceiling and opening onto a spacious veranda. The windows were flung open to admit the refreshing breeze and the welcome sunlight. Suddenly, the air was filled with the flutter of powerful wings, and four large black-plumed birds settled on the veranda and stepped into the room. Glancing up in surprise at this sudden interruption, the wizard exclaimed with annoyance, Here, what's the meaning of this intrusion?" Since all birds and animals in the Land of Oz possess the power of human speech, the Wizard naturally addressed the birds as he would have spoken to human beings. But the birds made no reply. Instead, two of them stepped swiftly toward Dorothy and the Wizard, who had risen in surprise and were standing beside their chairs. The two birds flung themselves on the shadows cast by the girl and the man. Instantly the birds vanished, and Dorothy and the Wizard found themselves staring in amazement at exact duplicates of themselves. Sensing that he was confronted by some sort of evil magic, the Wizard made an effort to reach his black bag of magic tools, which rested on a nearby table, but it was too late. Caught in the Mimic spell, the little man was powerless to move. Dorothy's plight was the same. She could not so much as lift her little finger. All this happened in much less time than I have taken to tell it, and it was so sudden and unexpected that our friends had not even had time to cry out. Now the mimic form of Dorothy, speaking in Dorothy's own voice, said to the two remaining birds, "Seize them, Ebo, and Stig, and see that my commands are fulfilled." One black bird grasped the form of the helpless Wizard, the other that of Dorothy. Then, flapping their powerful wings, the two birds passed through the windows and soared aloft, bearing their captives high into the heavens. Swiftly they left the Emerald City. In a few minutes it was no more than a lovely jewel set in the farmlands around it. The birds headed southeast in the direction of the Deadly Desert. At times in their flight, when the captives were able to exchange glances, Dorothy read in the Wizard's kindly eyes a mute expression of concern for his little comrade. The girl tried to reassure him, but it was difficult to look brave when she was unable to move even an eyelash, and besides, Dorothy had to admit to herself she didn't feel at all brave just now. In another minute, when Dorothy was gazing at the bird that was carrying her so swiftly through the air, she was startled to see the form of the creature shift and change. From a huge eagle-like bird, it changed to an enormous condor. Strange birds these were, Dorothy thought, which went about changing their shapes and stealing little girls and wizards. As they flew over the yellow land of the Winkies, the motion of the bird's body occasionally permitted Dorothy to look downward. Once she glimpsed, sparkling in the sunlight, the highly polished towers and minarets of a handsome tin castle. This, she knew, was the home of her old friend Nick Chopper, the Tin Woodman, Emperor of the Winkies. Dorothy found herself wondering what the kind-hearted Nick Chopper would say if he could know that at this moment his dear friends were being carried high in the air over his castle, prisoners of two giant blackbirds. But there was no use speculating in this fashion. The Tin Woodman was powerless to aid them, even if he had known their plight. With a start, Dorothy realized that the birds had crossed the border of Oz and were now flying over the Deadly Desert. The fact that they had left the Land of Oz behind them disturbed Dorothy greatly. Yet the little girl did not give way to fright. She had experienced so many strange and sometimes dangerous adventures in her lifetime that she had wisely learned never to despair. The journey over the desert seemed endless. Despite the great height at which the birds flew, Dorothy was beginning to feel faint and ill from the evil fumes of the sands by the time they reached the border of the land of the Phanfasms. However, once past the desert, she was revived by the fresh air. Where were these great birds taking them, and why? As Dorothy pondered, she noted a sharp mountain peak jutting suddenly out of the gray, grim land of desolate waste and stone that lay below. Straight for the mountain flew the birds. In a few more minutes they descended with their victims to the entrance of the mountain. Passing through the stone portal, the Mimiks retained their bird shapes, circling through the vast cavern of the hollow mountain. The caverns and corridors were deserted now that the sun was in the heavens, and the Mimiks had returned to their underground caverns to rest after the night of revelry. Styg and Ebo flew to a ledge of rock that jutted out from the mountain wall. Ebo muttered a magic word, and a rude stone door swung open, revealing a lightless cavern. Dorothy was thrust into the cave, and a moment later the wizard was deposited beside her in the darkness. Until now, Dorothy had entertained a vague hope that in some way the wizard's magic powers would come to their rescue. But since the little man had none of his magic tools with him, and could not speak to utter an incantation, nor move to make the motions of a charm, Dorothy realized that he was quite as powerless as she. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Dorothy and the Wizard Speak Strangely. "Ooh!" puffed the Scarecrow. "Whoosh!" gasped the Patchwork Girl. Colliding suddenly as they met headlong at a sharp turn in the garden path, both the Scarecrow and the Patchwork Girl tumbled in a heap on the garden walk. A moment later they had risen to sitting positions and were regarding each other comically. The Patchwork Girl was a sorry sight. The high-grade cotton in her patchwork or crazy quilt body was bunched together in all the wrong places. After running and dancing a great deal that morning, as she always did, the Patchwork Girl's body had sagged and she had grown dumpy in appearance. When this happened, she always lay down and rolled about until she had resumed her original plump shape. Now, after her abrupt meeting with the Scarecrow, her figure was in bad need of attention. The pointed toes of the red leather shoes sewn on her feet stood straight up. Her fingers, carefully formed and fitted with gold plates for fingernails, dug into the path on which she sat. Her shock of brown yarn hair hung down over her suspender button eyes and over her ears, which were made of thin plates of gold. Between the two rows of pearls sewn in her mouth for teeth, her scarlet plush tongue stuck out impudently at the Scarecrow. The Patchwork Girl's brains were slightly mixed, containing, among other qualities, a dash of poesy, which accounted for her habit of breaking into rhymes and jingles when it was least expected. Now she was too surprised to speak. She had been brought to life in the first place by a magic powder, and since she was always jolly and good-natured, the Patchwork Girl was a prime favorite among the Oz folks. Nicknamed Scraps, the queer girl laughed at dignity and liked nothing better than to dance and sing. It was impossible to be downcast for long in the company of this merry, carefree creature. "Why don't you look where you're going, Scraps?" said the Scarecrow ruefully, as he brushed his blue Munchkin farmer trousers. "Now that you mention it," replied the Patchwork Girl reprovingly, "I don't have X-ray eyes, so I couldn't see through to the other side of the hedge where I was going." "All right," said the Scarecrow as he rose to his feet. "Please accept my humble apologies." The straw man had gallantly assisted the Patchwork Girl to stand. "There's no harm done. The spill was as much my fault as it was yours. I was thinking so deeply that I didn't see you." "What were you thinking about?" asked Scraps. "Dorothy," replied the Scarecrow with a sigh. "Tell me, Scraps, have you seen her today?" "Not once," answered the Patchwork Girl, combing her yarn hair with her fingers. "Until a few minutes ago. I've spent the entire day with Aunt Em, who sewed tight some of my stitches that were coming loose, sewed on my eyes with new thread, so I wouldn't lose 'em, and sewed on a new pair of red shoes, as I'd worn holes in my old ones. Now I'm as good as new." "Well," replied the Scarecrow with his broad smile, "that may be true, but I'd say, no matter in how good condition you are, you're always just so." The smile quickly faded from the straw man's painted face as he continued seriously. "Scraps, I'm worried about Dorothy." "Don't worry about Dorothy. She's able to take care of herself," said practical Scraps. "You don't understand," explained the Scarecrow. "You see, yesterday after Ozma and Glinda left for the Forest of Burzee, Dorothy asked me to help her plan a banquet to celebrate their return. Dorothy wanted me to think up some ideas for the entertainment to accompany the dinner. I agreed to set my famous brains to work on the problem and spent all last night in deep thought. This morning, bright and early, I rushed to Dorothy and started to tell her the ideas I had. You can imagine my surprise when Dorothy stared at me as though she hadn't the faintest idea what I was talking about, and then turned and walked away from me." The Scarecrow paused, his brow wrinkled with perplexity. "I don't understand it," he continued. "It isn't like our sweet little Dorothy to be rude or absent-minded. She and the wizard have been in Ozma's chamber of magic all day, and I tried twice to see her, but each time she said she couldn't be disturbed." "Come to think of it," replied Scraps quickly, "Aunt Em remarked that she couldn't understand why Dorothy hadn't been in to see her. Dorothy always visits her Aunt Em and Uncle Henry at least once a day, but maybe she's busy ruling while Ozma's away." This explanation failed to satisfy the Scarecrow. He was gazing in the distance down the garden path. "Isn't that Trot and Cap'n Bill sitting on that bench over there?" "Whoop-de-doodle-hoo, Cap'n Bill and Trot, it's as like as not," sang the Patchwork Girl, turning a handspring and dancing toward the bench. The Scarecrow followed, and he and Scraps were warmly greeted by little Trot and old Cap'n Bill. The Scarecrow repeated his story of the strange manner in which Dorothy had been acting, but neither Trot nor Cap'n Bill had seen Dorothy that day. The old sailor was silent for a moment, considering. Then he said, "You know, it's funny. I was telling Trot only a minute ago that the wizard had me puzzled by the curious way he was behaving." "What do you mean?" asked the Scarecrow. "Well," went on Cap'n Bill, "for some time past I've been working on a boat for Ozma and her friends so they could go sailing on the lake just outside the Emerald City. I had everything I needed except for some tools, so the wizard lent me some of his that get the work done extra fast, 'cause they're magic tools. The boat's nearly finished, a handsome craft if I do say so myself. All she needs to make her trim is a coat of paint. I thought it would be nice to have her finished as a sort of surprise for Ozma when she returns from this here fairy conclave, so I asked the wizard to lend me his magic paint bucket and brush. The bucket always stays full, no matter how much paint you use from it, and the brush paints any color you want from the same bucket of paint. Well, the wizard just gave me a funny sort of look and walked away, mumbling something about being busy and having something important to do. 'Tain't like the wizard at all. Something ailing him," concluded Cap'n Bill, wagging his grizzled head. "Then it's the same thing that's ailing Dorothy," remarked the Scarecrow sagely. The four old friends were silent, each turning over the problem in his own mind. The bench on which Trot and Cap'n Bill were sitting was in front of a high hedge, so high that none of them could see over it. On the other side of the thick hedge ran another garden path. Suddenly they heard footsteps, as if several people were hurrying down the garden path which was hidden from their view. While they listened, wondering who it could be, the footsteps halted just opposite them on the other side of the hedge. Before they could call out a greeting, they recognized the voice of the wizard saying, "We can talk here. There's no one about. Now tell me, why are we wasting time in the garden?" "Because," it was the voice of Dorothy replying, "it would look suspicious if we did not leave the Chamber of Magic occasionally." "Have you found the spell yet?" asked the wizard's voice. "Not yet," replied Dorothy's voice. "I've been through only half of Ozma's magic record books. Give me time. It's there, and I'll find it." "Time?" replied the wizard's voice, raised in excitement. "We have no time to lose. Do you realize that Ozma and Glinda will be back in a day and a half? We must find the spell before then if we don't want Ozma to wreck our plans and rob us of the chance we have waited for." "Never fear," asserted Dorothy's voice. "I'll find the spell long before Ozma and Glinda return. We'll be ready for those two when they do come back." Gradually the voices subsided as the two walked slowly down the garden path toward the royal palace. On the other side of the hedge, Trot, Cap'n Bill, Scraps, and the Scarecrow stared at one another in bewilderment. What could this mean? It was incredible that Dorothy and the wizard could be plotting against their dearest friends, Ozma and Glinda. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of the Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7 In the Cavern of the Doomed. Neither Dorothy nor the wizard could tell how long they lay in their cavern prison deep in hollow Mount Illuso, but it is certain that minutes seemed like hours to them. While the wizard had recognized the country to which he and Dorothy had been carried as the land of the Phanfasms, he was not aware of the existence of Mount Illuso and its Mimic dwellers. He was sure, however, that the creatures who had captured Dorothy and him were not Phanfasms. He had seen the Phanfasms when those evil creatures had once attempted to invade Oz, and they bore no resemblance to the beings who had made Dorothy and him captives. Dorothy found some comfort in telling herself that as soon as Ozma and Glinda returned to the Emerald City, the impostors would be detected, and she and the wizard speedily rescued. But what if Ozma and Glinda were deceived? How long would she and the wizard be kept in the cave? What wicked plot was behind all this? And just how powerful and clever were the creatures who had captured her and the wizard? Suddenly something happened that banished all these puzzling questions. There was a light in the cavern. The two prisoners could see each other. True, the light was feeble, but it was increasing steadily in strength. As the light grew more brilliant, Dorothy felt pleasantly warm and glowing, as though she were lying in the bright sunlight. And then, to her intense joy, the little girl realized that the spell cast on her was broken. The light had released her. She was free to move about as she pleased. Dorothy jumped happily to her feet. The wizard, too, was freed from the spell, and a moment later was standing, smiling broadly with satisfaction. "Was the light your magic, wizard?" asked Dorothy eagerly. "No, my dear, I had nothing to do with the light," replied the wizard. "But I wonder who or what turned it on," said Dorothy. "Could it be a trick, do you think?" she asked after a moment's hesitation. "No, I believe not," replied the wizard. "There would be no point in our captors troubling themselves to enchant us and make us prisoners, and then releasing us from the enchantment. I believe we will find this light is a part of a greater mystery than we know anything about." "Well, seems to me there's plenty of mystery about everything that's happened today," said Dorothy. "What are we going to do now, wizard?" "Explore our prison," answered the little man promptly. Dorothy looked about her. They were entirely surrounded by the solid stone walls of the cavern, which was about 100 feet square. She could detect no sign of the door by which they had entered. "Look, wizard!" Dorothy exclaimed. "See how the light shines from one small point in the far end of the cavern?" "Yes," agreed the Wizard. "It's almost as if someone had built a powerful flashlight into the stone wall. Come, let's examine the light more closely." The two walked to the opposite side of the cavern and found that, as Dorothy had observed, the flood of light originated from one small point. This point was a circular bit of stone, round and polished, and no larger than a small button. "Why," exclaimed Dorothy, "it looks exactly like the button of an electric light switch. Wonder what would happen if I pressed it?" Impulsively, Dorothy reached out and pressed the button of rock with her finger. In the deep silence that filled the cave, the two adventurers detected a far-away humming sound, like the whirring of wheels in motion. As Dorothy and the Wizard listened, the sound grew louder. "What do you suppose it is?" whispered Dorothy. "I haven't the faintest idea," said the Wizard, "but I don't think we'll have to wait long to find out." At last the whirring sound seemed to be just opposite them on the other side of the stone wall. It stopped completely and there was silence. A second later, a section of the stone wall swung outward and Dorothy and the Wizard found themselves staring into a small room much like the car of an elevator. The car was painted bright blue, trimmed with red and gold, and sitting on a small stool was a curious little man. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Toto Makes a Discovery. "Where's Dorothy?" Toto asked pretty little Jellia Jam, Ozma's maid, as he paused outside the door of Dorothy's apartment early in the morning of the day after Ozma and Glinda departed. "She's gone up to the Wizard's rooms in the tower," replied Jellia Jam. "Thanks," said Toto. "I imagine Dorothy will have her hands full while Ozma is gone." With this, the little dog trotted down the corridor, philosophically seeking some other amusement. He hadn't gone very far before he was hailed by Betsy Bobbin, who appeared with a small wicker basket on her arm. "Hello, Toto," Betsy called. "Want to go with Hank and me? I'm going to pick wildflowers in the green fields outside the Emerald City, and Hank's coming along. I have a nice picnic lunch packed," the girl added, indicating the basket she carried. Now, there were few things Toto liked better than to get out in the country and frolic in the fields, so the little dog accepted the invitation gratefully. A short time later, Betsy, her devoted companion Hank the Mule, and Toto arrived at the gates of the Emerald City and were greeted by Omby Amby, the soldier with the green whiskers. He was very tall and wore a handsome green and gold uniform with a tall plumed hat. His long green beard fell below his waist, making him look even taller. In addition to being the keeper of the gates, Omby Amby was also the Royal Army of Oz, Princess Ozma's bodyguard, and the police force of the Emerald City. You might suppose that holding all these offices, Omby Amby was a very busy man. To the contrary, so seldom was there ever any breaking of the Oz laws, which were all just and reasonable, that it had been many years since the soldier with the green whiskers had acted in any of his official capacities other than that of Keeper of the Gates. As Omby Amby unlocked the gates for them, Betsy promised to bring him a bouquet of flowers for his wife, Tollydiggle. Outside the Emerald City lay pleasant, gently rolling fields in which buttercups and daisies grew in profusion. Sniffing the fresh country air, Toto ran happily across the field. Hank hee-hawed loudly and fell to munching the tall field grass. Betsy was delighted with the hundreds of pretty flowers and gathered several large bouquets. Shortly after noon, the happy trio sought the shade of a large tree. Nearby, a spring of cool, crystal clear water bubbled from a mossy bank and flowed across the field as a tiny brook. Betsy opened her basket and took out sandwiches, hard-boiled eggs, potato salad, and other picnic delicacies, which she and Toto shared. Betsy offered Hank a peanut butter sandwich, but the mule refused disdainfully, saying, "No, thank you, Betsy. I much prefer this fresh green grass." "Well, don't eat too much of it," advised the girl, "or you'll get the colic." The mule winked one eye at Toto and replied, "I'd be much more likely to get colic if I ate your strange human foods." After they had eaten and refreshed themselves with the water of the spring, they rested for a time in the cool shade of the tree, and then leisurely made their way back to the Emerald City. At the city's gates, Omby Amby welcomed them back and gratefully accepted the bouquet Betsy gave him for Tollydiggle. Arriving at the palace, the three friends said goodbye, Betsy going to her apartment, while Hank made his way to the royal stables to talk with his cronies, the Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger. Jellia Jam tripped down the palace steps on an errand, and Toto called to her, "Is Dorothy still busy?" "Yes," answered Jellia Jam. "She and the wizard have been in Ozma's Chamber of Magic all afternoon." This did not strike the little dog as strange. He knew Ozma might have left instructions for Dorothy and the wizard to carry out in the Chamber of Magic. As it was now nearly mid-afternoon, Toto decided to have a nap in the garden. Curling up in the cool earth under a large rose bush, he fell asleep, telling himself that he would awaken in time for dinner, when he would surely see Dorothy. Toto knew that however busy Dorothy and the wizard might be, they would leave the Chamber of Magic and appear for dinner, always a festive occasion in the grand dining room of the royal palace. Promptly at 7 o'clock, the inhabitants of the royal palace began to gather in the grand dining room. Cap'n Bill and Trot took their accustomed places at the table, as did Betsy Bobbin, Button Bright, the Shaggy Man, Aunt Em, and Uncle Henry. While the Scarecrow, the Patchwork Girl, and Tik-Tok the Machine Man were non-flesh and could not partake of the food, nevertheless they had their places at the table, for these dinners were as much occasions for the enjoyment of merry conversation as they were for satisfying hunger and thirst. At the far end of the room was a separate table shared by the animal companions of the Oz people. At this table were set places with proper foods for Hank the Mule, the Cowardly Lion, the Hungry Tiger, Billina the Yellow Hen, Eureka the Pink Kitten, the Woozy, Toto, and the Sawhorse. Although the Sawhorse was made of wood and required no food and seldom took part in the conversation, nevertheless the odd steed enjoyed listening to the table talk of the others. Everyone was at his place except Dorothy, the Wizard, and Toto, and of course Ozma's chair at the head of the table was vacant. Dorothy's place was at Ozma's right, while the Wizard sat at her left. A few minutes later, King and Queen Raah, having decided that it would arouse too much comment if they were absent from the dinner, entered the sumptuous dining room and took their places on either side of Ozma's vacant chair. Now only Toto remained absent. The truth was that the little dog had overslept and had awakened from his nap to find the shadows lengthening across the garden. Realizing he was late for dinner, Toto hurried to the nearest palace entrance and ran as quickly as he could to the grand dining room. As he entered, the first course of the meal was being served, and a ripple of conversation rose from the two tables. The Scarecrow and Scraps were chatting together, Betsy was telling Trot about the lovely wild flower she had found, and the Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger were discussing a visit they planned to their old jungle home in the forest far to the south in the Quadling Country. In spite of the apparent atmosphere of gaiety, This gathering was not at all like the merry company that usually assembled in the dining room for the evening meal. First of all, the absence of the radiant Ozma was keenly felt by the entire gathering, and this automatically subdued the spirit of the occasion. Next, no one at the table had failed to note and wonder at the fact that Dorothy and the Wizard, usually so cheerful and cordial, had merely nodded unsmilingly to their assembled friends as they had taken their places at the head of the table. Finally, Scraps, the Scarecrow, Trot, and Cap'n Bill, unable to get the strange conversation they had overheard in the garden earlier in the day, stole curious glances at Dorothy and the Wizard, seeking some clue to their unusual behavior. As Toto trotted into the dining room, his bright eyes immediately sought out his mistress. Toto stopped short. His body became tense with excitement. He barked loudly and then growled, "Where's Dorothy?" In the silence that fell over the dining room at the dog's unusual actions, Toto repeated his question. "Where's Dorothy?" he demanded. The Scarecrow was staring earnestly at Toto. "Why, here's Dorothy," the straw man answered. "Right here, where she always sits." "You're wrong. All of you are wrong," growled Toto ominously. The little dog was quivering with excitement. "Whoever that is sitting there might fool the rest of you, but she can't deceive me. She's not Dorothy at all. Something's happened to Dorothy." End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Mr. and Mrs. Hi-Lo. "Step right in, folks. Watch your step, miss. We're on our way up. Next stop, the top. Only 2 stops, bottom and top. Next stop's the top." The little man spoke with an air of importance as he smiled at Dorothy and the Wizard from the stool on which he was perched in the car which the opening in the stone wall had revealed. They peered at him curiously. "Shall we go in?" asked Dorothy, drawing a deep breath. "To be sure," said the Wizard. "Anything is better than this stone prison." "Ah, a philosopher and a wise one, too," remarked the little man. As soon as Dorothy and the Wizard were in the elevator, for such it proved to be, the stone door swung shut. At once the little man pressed one of several buttons on the side of the car, and again they heard the whirring sound which had puzzled them in the cavern. Dorothy concluded it was caused by the machinery that operated the elevator. The little car was shooting upward with a speed that caused her ears to ring. "Just swallow several times," advised the Wizard, sensing Dorothy's discomfort. "That will make equal the air pressure inside and outside your body. It's a trick I learned when I went up in my balloon to draw crowds to the circus back in Omaha." Dorothy did as the Wizard suggested and found the ringing sensation disappeared. "Who are you?" asked the Wizard, gazing curiously at the little man. "And where are you taking us?" "You don't know who I am?" exclaimed the little man with surprise. "After all, you know, you did ring for the elevator, and since I am the elevator operator, naturally I answered. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Hi-Lo, and I am taking you to the only other place the elevator goes, except for the bottom, and that's to the top of Mount Illuso. I assure you it's a far better place than the bottom." While he spoke, Dorothy had been regarding the little man, who called himself Hi-Lo. He was very short, his head coming only to Dorothy's waist. He was dressed in a bright blue uniform with big gold buttons. A red cap was perched at a jaunty angle on his head. His face was round and his cheeks as rosy as 2 apples. His blue eyes were very bright and friendly. But the oddest thing about him was that his clothes appeared to be a part of his body as though they were painted on, and Dorothy concluded he was most certainly made of some substance other than flesh and blood. "Ah, I see I've aroused your interest," remarked the little man with satisfaction. "Well, I'm proud to tell you that I am made of the finest white pine and painted with quick drying 4-hour enamel that flows easily from the brush and is guaranteed not to chip, crack, craze, or peel. I'm easily washable, too. Spots and stains wipe off in a jiffy with a damp cloth or sponge. No rubbing or scrubbing for me. And I suppose," Hi-Lo concluded vainly, "you've already admired my rich glossy finish and beautiful rainbow colors." Dorothy smiled at this speech, and the Wizard asked, "Tell me, Hi-Lo, do people live on the top of Mount Illuso?" "Of course," Hi-Lo replied in his cheerful voice. "We have a thriving community of folks. Pineville it's called. But we're all very happy and contented," he went on hastily. "There's not a lonesome pine among us, although there are several trails on the mountain top." "But are there no flesh and blood folks like us?" queried the Wizard. Before Hi-Lo could answer, the elevator came to an abrupt stop. "Here we are," announced Hi-Lo cheerily. He pressed another button. The door of the elevator swung open and Hi-Lo called, all out, top floor, all kinds of wooden goods, the best pine to be had, pine tables, pine chairs, pine houses, and pine people." Dorothy and the Wizard stepped from the elevator and surveyed the scene before them. Yes, this was certainly the top of Mount Illuso. The elevator exit was in a large stone wall, at least 10 feet in height, that appeared to circle the edge of the mountain top. Before them spread a dense pine forest, while a small path led from the elevator to a tiny cottage that stood nearby. The cottage was painted bright blue with trim white shutters, and smoke was rising cheerily from its red brick chimney. "Right this way. Just follow me, folks," said Hi-Lo, trotting along the path to the cottage, his little wooden legs moving with surprising speed. "Mrs. Hi-Lo will certainly be surprised to see you. You are a real event, the very first visitors we have ever had from down below." As they approached the tiny cottage, the front door swung open, and a little woman stood in the doorway. She was even smaller than Hi-Lo, and like him was made of wood and painted with the same bright enamels. She wore a blue and white apron over a red polka dot dress. On her head was a trim little lace cap. "My goodness!" she beamed. "Visitors at last! Do come in and make yourselves comfortable." The Wizard found it necessary to bend over to get in the doorway, so small was the cottage. Once inside, his head nearly touched the ceiling. The cottage was neatly and attractively furnished with comfortable pine chairs, tables, and a large davenport drawn before a fireplace on which a log fire crackled cheerfully. The air was sharp on the mountain top, so the bright fire was a welcome sight to the two wanderers. All the furniture glowed with the cheerful, gaudy hues of glossy enamel. Dorothy thought that the wholesome aroma of pine scent that filled the cottage was especially delightful. "Great pine cones!" exclaimed Mrs. Hi-Lo. "You must be half starved. I'll get you something to eat in no time at all. Tell me, would you like a delicious cross cut of pine steak with pine dust pudding, fresh crisp pine needle salad with turpentine dressing, and a strawberry pine cone for dessert?" Dorothy almost laughed aloud at this strange food, but the little Wizard answered courteously, "You are most kind, madam, but I fear our systems would not be able to digest the delicacies you suggest. Perhaps you have something that meat folk like us could eat?" "Of course!" cried Mrs. Hi-Lo. "How stupid of me! You are meat folks! Too bad!" she added critically. "It must be a terrible bother to take off and put on all those clothes, and to keep your hair trimmed and your nails pared." Now, Mother, let's not draw unkind comparisons, cautioned Hi-Lo diplomatically, as he settled himself into a comfortable chair. None of us is perfect, you know. Remember that spring when you sprouted a green twig on your right shoulder? Ha ha, you are right, said Mrs. Hi-Lo with a laugh. We all have our weak points. And with that, the little lady bustled off into the kitchen. Dorothy and the Wizard sat down gingerly on two of the largest chairs the room contained, but small as the chairs were, they proved quite sturdy and readily supported their weight. "Is there any way," asked the Wizard, "that we can leave this mountain top?" Hi-Lo sat bolt upright in his chair and stared at the Wizard in amazement. "Leave the mountain top?" he repeated as if he couldn't believe his own ears. "Do I understand you to say that you want to leave this delightful place, this most favored spot in the universe?" "We do," said the Wizard emphatically. "Our home is in the Land of Oz, and we desire to return there as quickly as possible." "But why?" asked Hi-Lo. "No place could be as delightful as this mountain top. Just wait until you have become acquainted with it. Our healthful, refreshing climate, our beautiful pine forest, our handsome village of Pineville, and its delightful people." "Have you ever been anywhere else?" asked the Wizard quietly. "No, never, but—" "Then permit me to say," replied the Wizard, "that you are not qualified to judge. Little Dorothy and I have traveled in many strange lands all over the world, and we prefer the Land of Oz for our home." "Well, everyone to his own taste, of course," muttered Hi-Lo, unconvinced and a trifle crestfallen. Just then Mrs. Hi-Lo re-entered the room bearing a tray laden with steaming hot foods. At her invitation, Dorothy and the Wizard pulled their chairs up to the table, and Mrs. Hi-Lo served the food on gleaming white enameled pine platters and dishes. There was savory vegetable soup, scrambled eggs, cheese, lettuce and tomato salad, chocolate layer cake, and lemonade. The food was delicious, and as Dorothy and the Wizard had not eaten since breakfast, and it was now nearly evening, they did full justice to the meal. Mr. and Mrs. Hi-Lo looked on with polite curiosity, marveling that the strangers could enjoy such odd food. When they had finished, the Wizard sighed with satisfaction and sat back in his chair. "Where did you get this excellent food, if there are no human beings on the mountain top?" he asked. "Oh, but there is one meat person like yourselves on Mount Illuso," said Mrs. Hi-Lo. "She is our ruler, and many years ago she gave me the magic recipe for the preparation of human food. As you are the first human visitors we have ever had, this is the first time I have had occasion to use the recipe." "Who is this ruler of yours?" inquired Dorothy. "She is a beautiful fairy princess named Ozana," Hi-Lo replied. "Ozana!" exclaimed Dorothy. "Wizard, did you hear that? Ozana! Doesn't that sound an awful lot like an Oz name?" "It certainly does," agreed the little man. "May we see this Princess Ozana of yours?" he asked Hi-Lo. "I was about to mention," replied Hi-Lo, "that it was Ozana's orders when she appointed me Keeper of the Elevator that I was to instruct any passengers I might have to seek her out at her home in Pineville." "Oh, let's go see her right away!" exclaimed Dorothy excitedly. "Not tonight," objected Hi-Lo. "You would never find your way through the pine forest in the dark. You may stay with us tonight and be on your way to see Princess Ozana early in the morning." Dorothy and the Wizard could offer no objection to this sensible and kindly offer of hospitality. Since it was now dark outside and the little cottage was cheerful and cozy with a log fire casting dancing reflections in the brightly enameled furniture, they were quite content to spend the night there. After several more questions about the ruler who called herself Ozana, Dorothy and the Wizard decided that Hi-Lo and his wife knew nothing more beyond the facts that Princess Ozana had created the pine folks and built the village for them to live in. Have you and Hilo always lived here alone? Dorothy asked Mrs. Hilo. The little woman's expression was sad as she answered, No, once we had a son. He was not a very good boy and was continually getting into mischief. He was the only one of our wooden folks who was ever discontented with life here on Mount Illuso. He wanted to travel and see the world. We could do nothing at all with him. Mrs. Hilo sighed and continued. One day a friendly stork paused in a long flight to rest on Mount Illuso, and the naughty boy persuaded the stork to carry him into the great outside world. From that time on we have never heard anything more of him. I often wonder what happened to our poor son, the little woman concluded in a sorrowful tone. How big was your boy? Asked the wizard. Was he just a little shaver? Oh, no, replied Mrs. Hilo. He was almost fully grown. A young stripling, I should call him. And was his name Charlie? Inquired the wizard thoughtfully. Yes, yes, it was. Oh, tell me, sir, implored Mrs. Hilo. Do you perchance know my son? Not personally, replied the wizard. But I can assure you, madam, that you have nothing to worry about where your son Charlie is concerned. That friendly stork knew his business and left Charlie on the right doorstep. The wizard had a small radio in his apartment in the royal palace in the Emerald City, which he sometimes turned on and listened to with much curiosity. But he never listened for long, as he was subject to headaches when listening to anything but good music. Oh, thank you, exclaimed Mrs. Hilo. It is such a relief to know that our Charlie turned out all right after all. There were times, the woman confessed, when I had a horrible suspicion that he was made from a bad grade of pine, knotty pine, you know. There are those who share that opinion, murmured the wizard, but Mrs. Hilo was so overjoyed to hear of her son that she paid no attention to the wizard's words. Hilo, who seemed totally uninterested in this conversation concerning his wayward son, merely muttered, A bad one, that youngster, and then yawned somewhat pointedly and remarked that since their beds were far too small for their guests to occupy, he and his wife would retire to their bedrooms, and Dorothy and the wizard would pass the night in the living room. Mrs. Hilo supplied them with warm blankets and soft pillows, and then she and Hilo bid them a happy good night. Dorothy made a snug bed on the davenport, while the wizard curled up cozily before the fire. Just before Dorothy dropped off to sleep, she asked, Do you suppose this Princess Ozana has any connection with Oz, wizard? It is possible, and then again the name may be merely a coincidence, my dear, the little man answered sleepily. So don't build your hopes too high. A moment later, Dorothy's eyes closed and she was sound asleep, dreaming that Toto, in a bright blue uniform with big gold buttons and a little red cap, was operating the elevator and saying, Right this way, Dorothy. Step lively, please. Going up. Next stop, Princess Ozana. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, The Village of Pineville. Dorothy and the wizard awakened bright and early the next morning, eager to pursue their adventures. Mrs. Hilo prepared a hearty breakfast for them from her magic recipe, and, as they made ready to leave the pretty little cottage, Hilo advised them, Just follow the trail that leads through the pine forest and you will come to the village of Pineville, where Princess Ozana lives. You can't miss it, and if you walk steadily you should be there by noon. Stepping from the cottage, Dorothy and the wizard found the morning sun bright and warm, and the air filled with the pungent aroma of pine from the forest. "Goodbye," called Mrs. Hilo from the door of the cottage. "Goodbye," called Mr. Hilo. "Don't forget to remember us to the Princess." "We won't," promised Dorothy. "We'll tell her how kind you've been to us." In a short time the cottage was lost to their view, and the two travelers were deep in the cool shade of the pine forest. The trail over which they walked was carpeted with pine needles, making a soft and pleasant path for their feet. Once, when they paused to rest for a few moments, a red squirrel frisked down a nearby tree and, sitting on a stump before Dorothy, asked saucily, "Where to, strangers?" "We're on our way to see Princess Ozana," said Dorothy. "Oh, are you indeed?" exclaimed the squirrel with a flirt of his whiskers. "Well, you are just halfway there. If you walk briskly, you'll find yourself out of the forest in another 2 hours." "How do you know we are just halfway there?" asked Dorothy. "Because I've measured the distance many times," replied the squirrel. "I should think you would prefer to live nearer the village of Pineville," remarked Dorothy. "It must be very lonesome here in this deep pine forest." "Ho, ho, ho! That shows how unobservant you mortals are!" exclaimed the red squirrel. "My family and I wouldn't think of living anywhere but here, no matter how lonely it is. Know why?" "No, I must say I don't," confessed the girl. "Look at my tree! Look at my tree!" chattered the squirrel, flirting his big bushy tail in the direction of the tree from which he had appeared. "Of course," chuckled the wizard, "it's a hickory tree." "But I don't see," began Dorothy in perplexity. "What do squirrels like best of all, my dear?" asked the wizard, smiling with amusement. "Oh, wizard, why didn't I think of that? They like nuts, of course." "Exactly," snapped the little red squirrel. "And since pine trees do not bear nuts and hickory trees do, well, city life and fine company may be all right for some folks, but I prefer to remain here in comfort where I know my family will be well provided for." And with that the wise little creature gave a leap and a bound and darted up the trunk of the one and only nut tree in all the pine forest. Dorothy and the wizard followed the pine needle trail on through the pine forest until finally the trees thinned and they stepped out into an open meadow bright with yellow buttercups. The sun was almost directly overhead by this time. Below the two travelers, in a pretty green valley that formed the center of the mountain top, lay a small village of several hundred cottages, all similar to Hilo's. The buildings were painted with glossy blue enamel and shone brilliantly in the sun. They were grouped in a circle about one large central cottage that differed from the others in that it was considerably larger, and from where Dorothy and the wizard stood, appeared to be surrounded by rather extensive gardens and grounds. Dorothy and the wizard followed the trail over the meadow to a point where it broadened into a street that led among the houses. The two travelers set out on this street, which was wide and pleasant and paved with blocks of white pine. As Dorothy and the wizard walked through the village, they saw that the cottages were occupied by wooden folks, much like Hilo and his wife. A wooden woman was washing the windows of her cottage. A wooden man with wooden shears was trimming the hedge around his house. Another was repairing the white picket fence around his cottage. Tiny wooden children, almost doll-like, they were so small, played in the yards. From one cottage a spotted wooden dog ran into the road and barked at the strangers. "I suppose he's made of dogwood," observed Dorothy with a smile. Dorothy and the wizard aroused much curiosity among the little wooden folk, most of whom paused in their work to stare at the strangers as they passed. But none of them seemed to fear the meat people. A wooden lady approached them, walking down the street with quick, lively steps. On her arm was a market basket full of green pine cones. Pausing, the wizard removed his hat and, in his most polite manner, addressed her. "Pardon me, madam. Can you tell me if this street leads to the palace of Princess Ozana?" "Palace? What's that?" asked the woman with a puzzled expression on her face. "I don't know what a palace is, sir, but if you follow this street you will come to the cottage where our Princess Ozana dwells." "Thank you, madam," said the wizard, and the little woman trotted busily down the street. In a few minutes more, Dorothy and the Wizard had reached the central part of Pineville. Here a trim white picket fence encircled a large area that seemed to be one huge flower garden with every sort of flower imaginable growing in it. In the exact center of this enclosure stood an attractive blue cottage, large enough to accommodate comfortably full-sized human beings. Just in front of the cottage was a pond of placid blue water. In the pond grew water lilies and all sorts of flowering plants that one finds in lakes and ponds. The path that led from the entrance of the cottage divided at the pond's edge and encircled the water, meeting on the opposite side of the pond and running again as a single path to a gate in the fence before which Dorothy and the Wizard stood. Forming a bower over the gate was a white wooden trellis covered with roses. From the center of the pretty trellis hung a blue sign with these words in white enameled letters: "Welcome, Cottage of Princess Ozana. Walk in." "Well, I guess that means us," said the Wizard with a smile, as he read the sign and pushed open the gate. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of the Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, Princess Ozana. Dorothy exclaimed with delight as they stepped through the garden gate. She had no idea any garden could be so beautiful. Flowers of every known variety grew in profusion. Save for the mossy paths that wound through the garden, there was not a spot of ground that was without blossoming plants. As for the pond, it was like a small sea of lovely blossoming water plants. At the far edge of the pond, Dorothy noted 3 graceful white swans sleeping in the shade of a large flowering bush that grew at the edge of the pond and trailed its blossoms into the water. The air was sweet with the perfume of thousands and thousands of flowers. "Oh, Wizard!" gasped Dorothy. "Did you ever see anything so lovely?" "It is indeed a beautiful sight," replied the little man admiringly. Here and there, throughout the garden, a score or more of little wooden men were busily at work. Some were watering plants with blue wooden pails, others were trimming blossoming bushes and hedges, some were digging out weeds, and others were building trellises for climbing vines. None of them took the slightest notice of Dorothy and the Wizard, so absorbed were they in their work. Not far from where Dorothy and the Wizard stood was a little maid on her knees digging with a trowel in the soft earth about a beautiful rambling rose bush that climbed over her on a blue trellis. "Let's ask her where we can find Princess Ozana," suggested Dorothy. A few steps brought them to the side of the maiden, who wore a pretty blue apron with pink petal design. On her hands were gardening gloves, and her golden hair fell loosely down her back. "I wonder," began the Wizard, "if you can tell us if the Princess Ozana is in?" The little maid looked up, regarding the strangers with friendly curiosity. Dorothy saw that she was very lovely. Her eyes were as soft as shy woodland violets, and of the same purple hue. Her skin as delicately colored as fragile petals, and her lips were like rosebuds. "No," the maid replied with a suspicion of a smile in her voice. "Princess Ozana is not in her cottage at the moment." "Perhaps you know where we can find her?" suggested the Wizard. At this, the little maid gave a silvery laugh and exclaimed, "You have found her. I am Princess Ozana." "Of course, Wizard," said Dorothy. "Princess Ozana is the only flesh and blood person on Mount Illuso, 'cept for us. So this just must be she. Besides," she added, "no one else could be so beautiful." "Thank you, my dear," said Ozana graciously, as she rose to her feet. "And you, sir," she continued, turning to the Wizard and sweetly easing the little man's embarrassment, "could scarcely be blamed for failing to recognize a princess garbed so simply and digging in a garden." "I most humbly ask your pardon," murmured the Wizard. Come, said Ozana. Let us go into my cottage where we can talk at ease. I must know all about you. As they started for the cottage, a small voice called after them, Wait! Wait for me! Don't leave me here! It's time for my milk! Dorothy glanced behind her and saw, scrambling from under a bush, a tiny kitten with pure white fur and china blue eyes. "Oh, what a darling!" she cried. "This is Felina, my pet kitten," announced Ozana as she knelt and gathered the small bundle of fur into her arms. Ozana led her guests to the living room of the cottage, an attractive room, fragrant with pine scent and comfortably furnished with pine chairs, divans, and tables. Pressing a button set in the pine-paneled wall, Ozana bid her guests make themselves comfortable while she ordered lunch. A moment later, a little wooden maid in a blue dress and spotless white pinafore, followed closely by a small wooden boy in a page's livery, appeared smiling in the doorway. The maid curtsied gracefully, and the boy bobbed his head as Ozana said, "This is Dolly and Poppet, my maid and page. Dolly, will you and Poppet please prepare sandwiches and refreshments for us? My guests have traveled far and must be quite hungry." "We are happy to serve your Highness," answered the wooden girl and boy in unison. With another curtsy and bow, the maid and page disappeared from the room. Ozana seated herself beside Dorothy and, taking the little girl's hand in her own, while she smiled warmly at the wizard, the fairy princess said, "Now let us become acquainted." "Well," began Dorothy, "this is the famous Wizard of Oz, and I am—" "Princess Dorothy of Oz," Ozana finished for her. "You know us?" asked Dorothy eagerly. "To be sure I know you," replied Ozana. "By my fairy arts I keep myself informed of all that goes on in the Emerald City. I recall when our wizard first visited the Land of Oz in his balloon, and when the cyclone lifted your house into the air and carried you, Dorothy, all the way from Kansas to Oz." "Why do you say our wizard?" asked the wizard. "Because I consider myself very close to the Land of Oz. I have a great fondness for all its inhabitants, and especially for the wizard who built the Emerald City and united the 4 countries of Oz," replied Ozana earnestly. The wizard blushed modestly. "As for building the Emerald City," he remarked, "I have said many times before that I only bossed the job. The Oz people themselves did all the work." Dorothy nodded. "When I first heard your name, Ozana, I suspected it was connected in some way with Oz." "I am called Ozana," stated the violet-eyed maid simply, "because I am a member of Queen Lurline's fairy band and first cousin of Princess Ozma of Oz." "Wizard, did you hear that? Princess Ozana is Ozma's cousin." At that moment, Dolly and Poppet reappeared, bearing trays heaped with sandwiches and glasses of cool, fresh milk. Dorothy was so excited over the revelation Ozana had just made that she could scarcely eat. While they enjoyed their food, Ozana and her guests exchanged stories. First, Dorothy and the wizard related their adventures. "I have no doubt at all," said Ozana, "that the 2 strange birds who took your forms were none other than King and Queen Raah, the Mimic monarchs." "Did you say Mimiks?" exclaimed Dorothy. "Yes, my dear. Mount Illuso is the home of the dread Mimiks." "Oh," said Dorothy thoughtfully. "That explains a lot. Why, only the day before she left the Land of Oz, Ozma and I were discussing the Mimiks." The wizard, who knew nothing of the Mimiks, listened with interest as Ozana described the creatures. "I don't understand," said the wizard when Ozana had finished, "why you should be living alone on the top of this mountain in which such evil creatures as the Mimiks dwell." "That question is easily answered," replied Ozana. Immediately after Queen Lurline enchanted the Mimics so that they could not attack the Oz inhabitants, she flew with me, her fairy companion, to the top of Mount Illuso. Here she left me, giving me certain fairy powers over the Mimics, and instructing me that I was to remain here at all times as the Guardian of Oz to prevent the Mimics from doing any harm to the Oz people should the evil creatures ever succeed in lifting Queen Lurline's spell. I was not even permitted to leave the mountain to attend Queen Lurline's fairy councils in the forest of Burzee. Then it must have been your fairy light that freed us from the Mimic enchantment in the cavern prison, surmised Dorothy. Yes, it was, Ozana admitted. You see, after Queen Lurline departed from Mount Illuso and I was left alone, the first thing I did was to place the button of light in that cavern which the Mimics call their Cavern of the Doomed. I enchanted the light so that it would appear soon after prisoners were placed in the cave. I gave the light power to overcome the spell cast by the Mimics on their victims. Then you are responsible for the elevator and Hi Lo too, said the wizard. Yes, replied Ozana. I placed the elevator in the mountain and stationed Hi Lo there to operate it. I did all this by my fairy arts. Of course, the Mimics have no knowledge of my arrangements to bring about the release of their victims. I knew the escaped prisoners would find their way to me, and I could aid them if I judged them worthy. But I never expected to find inhabitants of the land of Oz in the Mimic Cavern of the Doomed. How is it, asked the wizard, that the Mimics were able to capture Dorothy and me, despite the fact that we are inhabitants of the land of Oz? You must remember, said Ozana, that both you and Dorothy came to Oz from the great outside world, and neither of you was an inhabitant of Oz when Queen Lurline cast her spell over the Mimics. Hence, you were not protected by that spell. It was for just such an unlooked-for development as this that the wise Queen Lurline left me on this mountain top. May I ask then, said the wizard, why you knew nothing of the flight of the Mimic King and Queen to the Emerald City? Ozana's face flushed slightly at this question, and she replied hesitatingly, I must admit that I am fully responsible for all your troubles, but I plead with you to consider my side of the story. I have dwelt on this forsaken mountain top with no human companions for more than 200 years. At first, I amused myself by creating the little wooden people and building their pine village for them. But it was too much like playing with dolls, and I soon tired. Then I busied myself with my garden, growing in it every variety of flower that exists. This occupied me for many long years. Please remember, I had taken many precautions against the Mimics. I believed I could rely on my fairy light to free any prisoners in the Cavern of the Doomed, but apparently the Mimics took no captives they thought important enough to occupy the Cavern of the Doomed until they made you prisoners. And then my fairy light served me well. Can you find it in your hearts to forgive me that I did not spend all my time keeping guard over the Mimics through all those long years? Of course, we understand, Ozana, said Dorothy, pressing the fairy maid's hand affectionately. And I must confess, continued Ozana with a grateful smile at Dorothy, that had I not been so completely absorbed in my garden during the last few days, I would surely have known of Ozma and Glinda's departure from the Emerald City and your own plight. The wizard had been very thoughtful while Ozana was speaking. Now he asked, just what do you believe to be the plans of the two Mimics who are now masquerading as Dorothy and me in the Emerald City? Ozana was grave at this question. It is evident, she replied, that King and Queen Raah hope to take advantage of the absence of Ozma and Glinda to search for the counter charm that would release the Mimics from Queen Lurline's enchantment and permit them to overrun Oz. Queen Raah must have discovered by her black arts that Queen Lurline had given the secret of the magical antidote into Ozma's keeping, knowing it would be safest with Ozma. It may be, added Ozana thoughtfully, that if King and Queen Raah have not discovered the spell by the time Ozma and Glinda return, they would even be so bold as to remain in the Emerald City, hoping they could deceive Ozma and Glinda as they have the rest of the Oz folks. "What do you think they will do if they find the magic spell?" asked Dorothy fearfully. The violet depths of Ozana's eyes darkened as she considered. "I don't like to think about that, my dear," she answered slowly. After a moment's silence, Princess Ozana brightened. "Come now, let's not borrow trouble. The Mimic monarchs have had so little time that I am sure they could not have succeeded in their search. We have nothing to fear now. However, I will spend the entire afternoon and evening in study, and by use of my fairy arts I will be able to discover just what King and Queen Rah's plot is. With that knowledge, we can act wisely and quickly to defeat the Mimic monarchs." "Do you think we should wait that long?" asked the wizard. "It is necessary," replied Ozana firmly. "I must have time to study Raah and Um's actions during the past few days, and to prepare myself to fight them. Remember, they are powerful enemies. Unless I am mistaken, we shall be on our way to the Emerald City in the morning, and I shall be fully armed with whatever knowledge is necessary to defeat the Mimic monarchs completely. Do not worry, my friends. I am confident I can bring about the downfall of King and Queen Raah before Ozma and Glinda return to the Emerald City tomorrow." "Of course you are right," assented the wizard slowly. "Now," said Ozana, rising, "let me show you my garden, of which I am quite proud. I am sure you will find it so interesting that you will regret you have only one short afternoon to spend in it. I have passed countless days in it and found it ever more fascinating." The white kitten, Felina, had finished lapping up the milk from the bowl placed on the floor for her by the little wooden maid. Dorothy knelt, cuddling the tiny creature in her arms. "May I take Felina in the garden with us?" Dorothy asked. "To be sure," replied Ozana. "I shall be far too occupied this afternoon to give her my attention." As they stepped from Ozana's cottage into the garden, the Fairy Princess said, "I believe you will find my garden different from any you have ever seen. I call it my Story Blossom Garden." End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of the Magic Mimics in Oz by Jack Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, Story Blossom Garden. "Now I will show you why I call my garden Story Blossom Garden," began Ozana, as she advanced toward a rose tree laden with lovely blooms. "You see, these are not ordinary flowers. They are fairy flowers that I created with my fairy arts. And the soil in which they grow is magic soil. Take this rose, for instance." Here Ozana cupped a large red rose in her hands. "Look into its petals, Dorothy, and tell me what you see." "Why, the petals form a lovely girl's face!" Dorothy exclaimed in delight. "And so it is with all the blossoms in my garden," said Ozana. "If you look closely into them, you will see a human face. Now, Dorothy, put your ear close to the rose and listen." Dorothy did as she was bid, and quite clearly she heard a small but melodious voice say pleadingly, "Pick me, little girl, and I will tell you the sweetest story ever told, a love story." Dorothy looked at the rose in awe. "What does it mean?" she asked Ozana. "Simply that all the flowers in my garden are story blossom flowers. Pick a blossom and hold it to your ear, and it will tell you its story. When the story is done, the blossom will fade and wither." "Oh, but I shouldn't like any of the beautiful flowers to die," protested Dorothy. even to hear their lovely stories." "They do not die," replied Ozana. "As I said, these are no ordinary flowers. They do not grow from seeds or bulbs. Instead, as soon as a blossom has told its story, it fades and withers. Then one of my gardeners plants it, and in a few days it blooms afresh with a new story to tell. The flowers are all eager to be picked so that they may tell their stories. Just as ordinary flowers give off their perfumes freely and graciously, so my flowers love to breathe forth the fragrance of their stories. A poet once said that perfumes are the souls of flowers. I have succeeded in distilling those perfumes into words." "Can't the flowers tell their stories while they are still growing?" asked Dorothy. "No," replied Ozana. "Only when they are separated from their plants can they tell their stories." "Do all the roses tell the same love story?" Dorothy asked. "No, indeed," said Ozana. "While it is true that all the roses tell love stories, for the rose is the flower of love, all roses do not tell the same love story. Since no two rose blossoms are identical, no two blossoms tell the same story. It was my purpose in creating the garden to supply myself with a never-ending source of amusement as an escape from the boredom of living alone on this desolate mountain top. I was reminded of the princess in the Arabian Nights tales. You will recall that she told her stories for 1,001 nights. My story blossoms," Ozana concluded with a smile, "can tell many, many more than 1,001 stories. There are many thousands of blossoms in my garden, and each blossom has a different story." "You are certainly to be congratulated on your marvelous garden," said the wizard. "It is a miraculous feat of magic," he added admiringly. "Thank you," replied Ozana graciously. "And now I will leave you, as I must form our plans for tomorrow. I must ask you to excuse me from the evening meal. Dolly and Poppet will serve you, and when you are ready they will show you to your sleeping rooms. Goodbye for the present, my friends." Dorothy and the wizard bid their lovely hostess goodbye, and then turned to the wonderful garden of story blossoms. Putting Felina on the ground to romp beside her, Dorothy dropped to her knees before a cluster of pansies. As she bent her ear over one of the little flower faces, it murmured, "Pick me, little girl, pick me. I'll tell you an old-fashioned story of once upon a time about a wicked witch and a beautiful princess." The wizard found himself admiring the flaming beauty of a stately tiger lily. Placing his ear close to the blossom, he listened and heard the flower say in a throaty voice, "Pick me, O man, and hear a thrilling story of splendid silken beasts in their sultry jungle lairs." Now Dorothy was listening to a purple thistle that spoke with a rich Scottish burr. "Pick me, little girl, and ye'll make naw mistake, for I'll tell ye a tale of a Highland lassie for Auld Lang Syne." Noticing a tawny blossom with gay purple spots, Dorothy placed her ear close to it. This was a harlequin flower, and it said, "Pick me, my child, and I'll tell you a wonder tale about Merryland and its Valley of Clowns, where dwell the happy, fun-loving clowns who delight in making children laugh." Dorothy remembered reading in a storybook about Merryland and the Valley of Clowns. Next was a black-eyed Susan that murmured to Dorothy, "Pick me, and I will tell you the story of 3 things that men love best, black eyes and brown and blue. Men love them all, but oh, black eyes, men love and die for you." Dorothy smiled and moved on to a daisy, which whispered to her in halting, doubtful tones, "Does he really love her? I shouldn't tell, but I know, and I will tell if only you pick me, little girl." "And I thought daisies didn't tell," Dorothy said to herself. She stopped before a rambling rose that spoke in a rapid, excited voice and wanted to relate a story of a vagabond adventure in far-away places. Then a bright red tulip whispered about a tale of windmills and Holland canals and pretty Dutch girls. At last the little girl came to a sunflower so tall that she had to stand on tiptoe to hear its words. "Pick me," the sunflower urged, "and hear my story of sun-baked prairies and western farm homes and great winds that sweep across the plains." "I wonder," thought Dorothy, "if the sunflower would tell me a story about my old home in Kansas. There used to be a great many sunflowers on Uncle Henry's farm back there." A tiny violet growing in a mossy bed caught the girl's eye, and as she knelt to hear its words, a shrill, unpleasant voice exclaimed, "Pick me! Pick me! Pick me immediately! I'll tell you a story that will burn your ears off, all about Dick Superguy, greatest detective in the world. He can't be killed. He's all powerful." Dorothy was sure the shy little violet hadn't uttered these words. While she looked around to see where the rude voice was coming from, one of the little wooden gardeners stepped up and said apologetically, "Beg your pardon, miss, it's just a weed. They're always loud and noisy, and while we don't care much for their stories, we feel they have as much right to grow as any other plants. Even a magic fairy garden has its weeds." The wizard had strolled over to the pond of placid blue water, and placing his ear close to a green pad on which nestled an exquisite water lily, he heard these words: "Pick me, O man, and I'll tell you a tale of a magic white ship that sails the jeweled seas, and of the strange creatures that dwell in the blue depths." Turning to a lotus blossom, the wizard heard a sleepy voice murmur, "Pick me, pick me. I'll carry you afar to the secret islands of the never-ending nights, where the winds are music in the palm trees, and the hours are woven of delights." Now that they had listened to the pleading voices of so many of the blossoms, Dorothy and the wizard decided to pick some of them and hear their stories. Dorothy's first selection was a Jack in the Pulpit, which proved to be an unfortunate choice, as the story the blossom told was preachy and sermon-like. She decided the blossom was a trifle green. Next she tried a daffodil. The story this blossom whispered to her in silver tones was about a lovely spring maiden who went dancing around the earth, and at her approach all ugliness and coldness and bitterness vanished. In the spring maiden's wake appeared a trail of anemones and violets and daffodils and tulips and gentle winds that caused new hopes to arise in the hearts of the winter-weary people. The wizard picked a pink carnation. This spicily scented blossom told him an exciting story of intrigue and adventure in high places. It was a romantic, dashing story full of cleverness and surprises. Then the wizard plucked a cluster of purple lilacs. Each of the tiny blossoms growing on the stem joined in a chorus to sing him a story of home and love, of patience and virtue, and all the common things of life in which the poorest may find riches and happiness. Almost before Dorothy and the wizard realized it, the shadows of evening were lengthening over the garden, and Dolly and Poppet appeared to inform them the evening meal was awaiting them. Dorothy picked up the white kitten which had fallen asleep in the shadow of a nearby hedge, and she and the wizard followed the maid and the page back to the cheery comfort of Ozana's cottage. They chatted happily over the good food served them by Dolly and Poppet. Felina had her bowl of milk on the floor near Dorothy's chair. Then, since they realized the next day was likely to be a busy and exciting one, they followed Dolly and Poppet to the rooms Ozana had prepared for them and said good night at their doors. The rooms were delightfully furnished with deep, soft beds and everything to make them comfortable for the night. As Dorothy pulled the covers over her and Felina snuggled into a small furry ball at the girl's feet, Dolly reappeared with a poppy blossom in her hand. "Here, Princess Dorothy," the thoughtful little maid said. "Listen to the story of the poppy blossom and you'll be sure to sleep well." So Dorothy listened to the soft, slumberous voice of the poppy and was asleep almost before the tale was finished. What kind of story did the sweet poppy tell? Why, a bedtime story, of course. End of chapter 12.